When I asked my son why I was not invited to my first grandson's baby shower, my daughter-in-law looked me up and down and said, "You wouldn't fit in with our friends. It is an aesthetic thing." A week later, she called me sobbing, begging for $30,000 to save them from total ruin. I just smiled into the phone and asked her, "Didn't I warn you?" I am Vincent. I am 69 years old, and before I tell you exactly how I dismantled the entitled hollow life I had secretly built for my ungrateful son, let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not owed, and that family is defined by loyalty, not just blood. The morning I discovered the truth. I was standing in my garage surrounded by the smell of sawdust and strong black coffee. My hands, calloused and scarred from 40 years of building a logistics company from the ground up, were covered in fine dust. I was carefully sanding the edges of a crib made of solid cherry wood. I had spent the last 3 months working on it every single day since Brian announced they were expecting a boy. Every spindle was turned by my own hands, every joint perfectly fitted, without a single metal screw. I wanted my grandson to sleep in something built with love, something that had soul unlike the cheap, mass-produced furniture my daughter-in-law Madison seemed to obsess over. I was whistling an old tune my late wife Carol used to love, running a cloth over the smooth wood to check for any rough spots when my iPad sitting on the workbench lit up with a notification. It was an Instagram alert. Madison was broadcasting live. I wiped my hands on my flannel shirt and tapped the screen, expecting to see a quick update about the baby's nursery or maybe a casual weekend brunch. Instead, the screen filled with a chaotic, brilliant flash of gold and white balloons, towering floral arrangements of imported white roses, and waiters in crisp black vests carrying trays of crystal champagne flutes. The location tag at the top of the screen read Oak Ridge Country Club. It was the most exclusive, ridiculously expensive venue in the county. A banner draped across the main fireplace read, "Welcome Baby Boy," in elegant gold cursive lettering. I stood there frozen in my dusty garage, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses blaring from the small tablet speaker. The camera panned around the room, showing dozens of people dressed in designer pastel clothing. I saw Madison's friends from her yoga studio, her parents looking smug by the chocolate fountain, and the wealthy investors from her failing startup company. Then the camera swung to Brian. My son. The boy I had raised alone after his mother passed away when he was 14. He was wearing a tailored linen suit, holding a gift box wrapped in silver paper, smiling awkwardly for the camera. They were having the baby shower. The event I had been asking about for months, the one Madison kept saying they had not planned yet because they were too busy. It was happening right now, less than 10 miles away. I looked down at the cherry wood crib, at my sawdust-covered flannel, at the old work boots I wore every day. The contrast was a physical blow to my chest. A $20,000 party paid for with money they did not actually have, and the grandfather was deliberately excluded. I watched as Madison flipped the camera to her perfectly made-up face, squealing into the microphone about how blessed they were to share this intimate moment with their true circle of friends. I did not feel angry in that exact moment. I felt a cold, hollow emptiness open up in my stomach. The kind of emptiness that swallows decades of unconditional love and spits out pure, unadulterated clarity. I reached out and pressed the power button on the iPad, cutting off the cheerful noise. The garage was violently silent again. I did not throw anything. I did not scream. The man who had navigated cutthroat union negotiations and survived the sudden death of his soulmate did not throw tantrums. Instead, I walked over to my workbench and picked up the small, delicate wooden mobile I had finished painting the night before. I had carved little animals out of cedar, elephants, lions, and bears attached to a polished ring. It was meant to hang over the crib. I carefully placed the mobile into a simple cardboard box, tucked it under my arm, and walked out to my driveway. My truck was a 2010 Ford. It was reliable, dented, and loud. It was exactly the kind of vehicle Madison despised having parked in front of their modern leased townhouse. I climbed in, turned the key, and listened to the engine rumble to life. The drive to their neighborhood usually took 20 minutes, but that day it felt like I was driving through thick mud. Every street corner, every stoplight brought back a memory of Brian, teaching him to ride a bike, paying off his massive college tuition so he could graduate without a single cent of debt, buying him his first car, and later after I quietly sold my freight company for $38 million setting up the blind trusts. I never told Brian about the massive wealth I acquired. When Carol died, I realized that handing a grieving, unmotivated teenager a fortune would destroy him. So I lived exactly as I always had. In the same house, wearing the same clothes, pretending my retirement was comfortable but modest. I wanted Brian to learn the value of $1. But when he married Madison, a woman whose entire personality was built on social climbing and brand names, I knew they would drown. So I cheated. I had my wealth manager, Alan Croft, set up blind subsidies. The bank miraculously approved their mortgage for a townhouse they could not afford, because my trust secretly guaranteed it and paid 60% of the monthly premium. Madison's little boutique startup company received generous quarterly dividends from an anonymous angel investor, which was just my holding company, keeping her afloat. I funded the illusion of their success so my son would not feel like a failure. And this was my reward. I pulled into their gated community, the tires of my old Ford crunching loudly against the pristine driveway of their 3-story glass and steel townhouse. I parked right behind Madison's brand new luxury SUV. I grabbed the cardboard box and walked up the floating concrete steps. The front door was slightly ajar. They must have just gotten home from the club. I pushed the door open and stepped into the foyer. The townhouse smelled of expensive perfume and catered food. The living room was the disaster zone of ripped silver wrapping paper, empty gift bags, and tissue paper strewn across the imported Italian leather sofas. Madison was sitting on the floor, still wearing her silk maternity dress, frantically logging gifts into a spreadsheet on her laptop. Brian was carrying a stack of designer baby clothes toward the hallway. He froze when he saw me standing there. The color drained from my son's face so fast, he looked practically translucent. He swallowed hard, the stack of clothes trembling slightly in his hands. Madison, noticing his sudden silence, looked up from her screen. Her expression instantly morphed from joyous greed to deep, profound annoyance. She did not look guilty. She looked like she had just found a stray dog wandering around her pristine living room. I did not say a word at first. I walked slowly across the room, my heavy boots thudding against their flawless hardwood floors. I stopped at the massive marble kitchen island. I set the cardboard box down, opened the flaps, and carefully lifted the carved cedar mobile. I placed it gently on the cold marble. The little wooden elephants and bears swayed slightly on their strings. It looked entirely out of place in this sterile modern museum of a house. Why was I not there? I asked. My voice was low, devoid of any shouting or dramatic wavering. It was the calm, steady voice of a man demanding a factual answer. Brian opened his mouth to speak, a stuttering, pathetic noise escaping his throat, but Madison cut him off before he could form a single excuse. She slammed her laptop shut and sighed, rolling her eyes as she struggled to stand up. "Let us be honest, Vincent," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. Her voice was dripping with that artificial, condescending sweetness she used when speaking to service workers. It was a catered event at Oak Ridge. We had a string quartet. We had the partners from Brian's firm, my investors, and the girls from the country club board. You wearing your faded flannel and talking to everyone about hardware stores and lumber prices, it just would not work. You would not fit in with our friends. It is an aesthetic thing. We wanted a certain vibe for the photos, and you just do not fit that aesthetic. I looked at Madison, really looked at her. I saw the thousands of dollars of cosmetic procedures, the hollow ambition in her eyes, the desperate need to project wealth to people who did not actually care about her. Then I turned my gaze to Brian, my son. The boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose college degree I had funded by working 70-hour weeks. He was standing there staring intensely at the floorboards. He did not defend me. He did not tell his wife she was out of line. He chose the path of least resistance, letting the woman who spent his money humiliate the man who provided it. His cowardly silence was louder than a gunshot. It shattered the last remaining illusion I had, that my son was a good man trapped by a bad woman. He was a willing participant. The love I felt for them, the paternal instinct to protect and provide, simply evaporated. It was not a slow fade. It was an instant, clean severing of emotional tissue. They saw me as a useless, embarrassing relic, an old man who did not fit their aesthetic. I nodded slowly. I reached out and picked the wooden mobile back up off the marble counter. I placed it back into the cardboard box and tucked it under my arm. "I understand," I said quietly. "I truly do." I turned around and walked toward the door. Madison scoffed behind me, muttering something about how I was being dramatic and ruining the mood. Brian finally managed to squeak out a pathetic apology, calling out, "Dad, wait, it is not like that." But I did not stop. I did not turn back. I walked out of the house, pulled the front door shut until it clicked, and walked down the concrete steps to my truck. I climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door, sealing myself in the quiet cab. The anger finally arrived, but it was not a hot, explosive rage. It was a freezing, calculated storm. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the private number of Alan Croft, my wealth manager and attorney. He picked up on the second ring. "Alan, it is Vincent," I said, my eyes fixed on the front window of the townhouse where Madison was already back to typing on her laptop. "Good afternoon, Vincent. What can I do for you today?" "I need you to execute a complete financial retraction," I said, my voice steady as stone. "Terminate the blind subsidy on Brian's mortgage immediately. Notify the bank that the guarantor is withdrawing support as of this billing cycle. Next, cut the anonymous dividend payments to Madison's startup company. Freeze the shell account and dissolve the angel investor profile." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Alan knew the history. He knew why I had set those nets up in the first place. "Are you absolutely certain, Vincent? If we pull the safety nets now, they will be exposed to their actual debt-to-income ratio. They will hit the financial floor in less than 30 days. "That is exactly the point, Alan," I replied, turning the key in the ignition. "Let them hit the floor. If my aesthetic does not fit their lifestyle, then my money certainly should not fund it." I hung up the phone, put the truck in gear, and drove away from the gated community, leaving my son and his wife to the luxurious, crumbling castle they thought they had built on their own. The drought was coming, and they had absolutely no idea how completely dry their well was about to become. 2 weeks passed since I walked out of that glass and steel townhouse. For me, those 14 days were peaceful. I finished the cherry wood crib, covered it in a canvas tarp, and pushed it to the back of my garage. I spent my mornings drinking cheap diner coffee and my afternoons volunteering. The silence in my life was a clean space I had intentionally created. But miles away in the artificial world Brian and Madison inhabited, the financial oxygen had been entirely shut off. I did not need to be there to know exactly how the collapse began. Alan Croft had systems in place to monitor the exact moment the blind trusts stopped padding their accounts. The first tremor of their ruined reality struck on a Tuesday afternoon right in the middle of Oak Ridge Country Club. Madison had gathered 3 of her most influential friends for a post-baby shower spa day. She was wearing a new silk robe, sipping cucumber water, and complaining about the stress of managing a household. When the afternoon concluded, the spa manager approached their lounge area. She was holding a sleek black leather check presenter. Madison casually dropped her heavy metal credit card onto the tray without even looking at the bill. The total was nearly $2,000 for the massages and her monthly club dues. The manager walked away, but returned less than 5 minutes later. The flattery was gone from her face, replaced by an icy professionalism. She leaned in close to Madison and whispered that the card had been declined. Madison laughed out loud, waving her hand dismissively. She told the manager it was an absurd bank error. She pulled out a second premium gold card she kept for emergencies and handed it over. Her friends were trying to look away, but the silence in their small circle was absolute. The manager returned a second time. The gold card was also declined. Madison felt the blood rush to her face. The flush of deep humiliation crept up her neck. Her friends suddenly became very interested in their phones. One of them, the wife of a real estate developer, quietly offered to cover the bill. Madison snapped at her, her voice shrill and panicked, insisting that Brian just needed to transfer funds from their investment accounts. She snatched the bill, signed a promissory slip, and rushed out of the spa, leaving her wealthy friends to whisper behind her back. She practically ran to the valet stand. She aggressively grabbed the keys to her luxury vehicle and climbed inside. Her hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She sped out of the country club gates and tried to log into her banking app. The screen flashed a red warning banner indicating her accounts were locked due to insufficient funds. The boutique startup she ran had not made a genuine profit in over 2 years. She relied entirely on the generous quarterly dividends from an anonymous angel investor to keep the business alive. She dialed her business partner, demanding to know if the investor payout had cleared. Her partner sounded exhausted, informing Madison that the investor portal had been completely deleted. The funding was gone. The startup account was overdrawn. Madison threw her phone onto the passenger seat. She drove recklessly through the pristine streets, terrified that her neighbors could somehow smell the poverty radiating from her car. While Madison was fleeing the country club, Brian was sitting in his glass-walled office. He was supposed to be reviewing ad copy, but instead he was frantically refreshing his banking application on his phone. It was the 15th of the month. This was the exact day he always received what he believed was his quarterly executive bonus. For 4 years, a deposit of $12,000 had miraculously appeared in his account, keeping his extravagant lifestyle afloat. He believed he was highly valued by his company. He had no idea the money was a scheduled transfer from my holding company. Brian refreshed the app again. The screen loaded, displaying a balance of $340. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The mortgage payment for the townhouse was due in 3 days. The lease payment for the luxury vehicle was already late. He immediately picked up his desk phone and dialed the human resources director. He tried to keep his voice casual, asking if there was a glitch in the payroll software regarding the quarterly bonuses. The director was silent for a long moment, before explaining that the firm did not offer quarterly bonuses to project managers. She told Brian he must be confused, as his compensation package was strictly a base salary. Brian insisted there was a mistake, his voice rising in panic, telling her he had received those bonuses for years. The director firmly stated that whatever money he had been receiving absolutely did not come from their payroll department. Brian hung up the phone, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him. He logged into the mortgage portal to check their balance, only to discover another horrifying truth. The monthly payment, which was usually subsidized by a mysterious trust he thought was tied to a first-time homebuyer program, was now listed at its full amount. The payment had tripled. For years he had walked around with the unearned confidence of a self-made man. He had mocked my simple life and my calloused hands, fully believing his corporate job made him vastly superior. Now, looking at his actual salary stripped of the secret financial life support I had provided, he realized he was barely middle class. He could not afford the Italian suits he wore, or the country club memberships. He was a thoroughly average employee, living a millionaire lifestyle. Panic turned into a desperate urge to flee. He packed his briefcase and rushed to the parking garage. They both arrived at the townhouse at the exact same time. Madison marched through the front door, tears of rage and humiliation streaming down her face. She threw her expensive purse onto the marble counter. the same counter where I had left the wooden mobile. Brian walked in right behind her, looking pale and completely broken. Madison immediately began screaming at him, demanding to know why her cards were declining and how he could embarrass her in front of the most important women in the city. Brian did not yell back. He just dropped his briefcase on the floor and looked at his wife with hollow, terrified eyes. He told her there were no funds. He told her the bonuses were a lie, the mortgage subsidy was gone, and they had less than $400 to their name. Madison stopped screaming. The pristine walls of their leased townhouse seemed to close in on them. For the first time in their marriage, there was no safety net, no anonymous check, and no naive old man to exploit. The drought had officially begun. The drive into the downtown financial district was always a chore. My heavy work boots felt out of place pressing down on the pedals of the old Ford, surrounded by sleek imported sports cars and towering glass skyscrapers. I parked in the underground garage of the towering steel monolith that housed Alan Croft and his team of corporate wealth managers. The parking attendant, a young kid in a sharp red vest, looked at my faded flannel shirt and dented bumper with a mixture of pity and confusion. He clearly wondered how I could afford the $50 hourly parking rate. I simply handed him the keys and walked toward the private elevators. Alan occupied the entire 42nd floor. It was a silent fortress of polished mahogany frosted glass and thick carpets that absorbed the sound of my heavy footsteps. I walked past the reception desk where a young woman in a tailored suit offered me sparkling water. I politely declined and walked straight into the corner office. Alan was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. He turned around as I entered. Alan and I had known each other for over 2 decades. He was the only person alive who knew the exact mathematical reality of my life. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, a stark contrast to my sawdust-covered jeans. He walked over to his massive oak desk and gestured for me to sit down. I took a seat in the heavy leather chair, feeling the familiar ache in my lower back from decades of lifting cargo crates. Alan did not offer empty pleasantries. He opened a thick manila folder and slid a stack of documents across the polished wood. "It is done, Vincent," he said quietly, taking his seat across from me. The blind subsidy on the townhouse mortgage was officially terminated at 9 o'clock this morning. The bank has already recalculated their premium and issued the adjustment notice. Furthermore, the shell corporation funding Madison and her boutique startup has been completely dissolved. I personally supervised the deletion of the angel investor profile. They are entirely cut off from the Clara Trust. I looked down at the documents. They were just pieces of paper covered in legal jargon, but they represented the absolute demolition of my son's artificial reality. I reached out and traced the edge of the folder with my calloused thumb. I felt a heavy weight settle in my chest. Not of regret, but of a profound, exhausting sadness. "How fast will it happen?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the papers. Alan leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Without your capital padding their accounts," he explained, "they will default on the townhouse by the 1st of next month. The vehicle leases will bounce within 10 days. Madison has been bleeding money through that startup for 2 years, and without the quarterly dividends, her business account is already overdrawn. I give it less than 3 weeks before they are drowning in collection notices." Alan paused, watching me carefully. He had been there during the hardest years of my life. He knew exactly what this money represented. "You know, Vincent," he said softly, "you built an empire from absolute scratch. You and Carol sacrificed everything for that freight business. I remember the days when you were driving the trucks yourself, sleeping in the dispatch office, eating cold soup from a thermos just to make payroll." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the memory of Carol wash over me. She had been the backbone of everything. When we started the logistics company, we had 2 used delivery vans and a mountain of debt. She ran the dispatch radio from our tiny kitchen, while I drove endless miles across state lines. We missed holidays, we missed vacations, we poured our blood and sweat into every single contract. We did it so Brian would never have to know the suffocating grip of poverty. But then the cancer came. It was fast and brutal. By the time the logistics company became a regional powerhouse, she was too sick to enjoy any of it. I sold the company for $38 million 6 years ago. I told Alan, my voice tight with old grief. I sold it because walking into that warehouse without her felt like walking into a graveyard. The money meant absolutely nothing without her there to share it. But I also remembered the promise I made to her in the hospital. We promised we would raise a boy who understood the value of hard work. A boy who would be a good man, not just a rich man. Alan nodded, understanding perfectly. That is why we established the trusts, he said. You could have handed Brian $5 million the day he graduated college. You could have bought him a mansion in cash. But you insisted on living in your same old house, driving that same old truck. You hid $38 million to protect him from his own entitlement. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I wanted him to earn his place in the world. I explained. I wanted him to feel the pride of paying his own electric bill, of earning a promotion. I wanted him to be hungry enough to build character. But I am still his father. I could not bear to see him struggle too hard. So I told you to set up the safety nets, the mortgage assistance, the anonymous investments. I thought I was giving him a gentle push from behind, a little invisible help, so he could build his life without the crushing stress I had to endure. You gave him a foundation, Alan corrected me gently. But Madison turned that foundation into a throne. She leveraged your hidden generosity to finance a lifestyle of extreme arrogance. And Brian let her do it. He stopped trying to grow because he thought he was already at the top of the mountain. I stood up from the leather chair and walked over to the massive window. I looked down at the tiny cars crawling along the city streets far below. I had spent my entire life trying to be a shield for my family, absorbing the blows of the world so they could live comfortably. But by shielding Brian from every consequence, I had accidentally created a man who lacked a spine. He stood there in that pristine living room, surrounded by thousands of dollars of useless luxury items, and let his wife tell me I was not good enough to attend my own grandson's baby shower. He let her erase me from their lives because I did not fit their wealthy aesthetic. They are going to panic, Alan said from behind me, pulling me back to the present moment. When people like Madison lose their social currency, they become desperate. She will try to secure outside funding. She will likely look for high-interest loans or leverage the remaining equity they do not actually own. She will drag Brian down into a very dark financial pit. I turned away from this window and faced my old friend. Let her try, I said, my voice completely stripped of any lingering paternal softness. I am done playing the silent benefactor. I am done pretending to be a poor old man just to make them feel comfortable. If they want to live in the real world, they are going to feel the full weight of it. Alan closed the manila folder and slid it into his desk drawer. The locks are engaged, Vincent. There is no turning back now. If she comes begging for money, what do you want me to do? I walked back to the desk and picked up my worn-out leather wallet. You do nothing, Alan. You do not answer her calls, and you do not respond to Brian if he reaches out to the firm. They wanted to be surrounded by their special wealthy friends. Let us see how long those friendships last when the credit cards stop working and the champagne stops flowing. I thanked Alan for his time and walked out of the polished office. I took the silent elevator back down to the concrete parking garage. As I climbed into my old Ford truck and started the loud rumbling engine, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Madison. It was the first time she had reached out to me directly in over 6 months. The message was short and frantic. Vincent, please call me immediately. We have a massive emergency, and Brian is having a panic attack. We need your help. I stared at the screen for a long moment. 2 weeks ago, I would have dropped everything, rushed to the bank, and sacrificed whatever they demanded to keep them safe. but the man who would have done that died the moment they told him he did not fit in. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, completely ignoring the message, and drove out of the garage into the bright city sunlight. I needed to hire a forensic accountant because I knew exactly what she was going to ask for, and I wanted to be fully prepared to watch her burn. 3 days after I authorized Alan to cut the financial lifelines, the peace in my garage was finally broken. I was standing at my workbench, carefully measuring a piece of rich mahogany for a new project. I had decided to build a rocking chair. The rhythmic sound of my handplane shaving thin ribbons of wood was the only noise in the room. The scent of cedar and sawdust hung heavy in the air. I found a profound comfort in the predictability of wood. If you measure it correctly, if you cut it with precision, it does exactly what it is supposed to do. It does not lie to you. It does not pretend to be something it is not. Humans, on the other hand, are infinitely more complicated and far more prone to rot from the inside out. I knew the silence would not last. Alan had warned me that the collection notices would start hitting their mailbox by the end of the week. I was just waiting to see who would break first. Would it be Brian, my own flesh and blood, finally swallowing his pride and acting like a man, or would it be Madison trying to find a new angle to exploit the old man she despised? My answer came at exactly 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. The cheap plastic cell phone sitting next to my toolbox began to buzz, vibrating violently against the metal table. I wiped my hands on my canvas apron, picked up the phone, and looked at the screen. It was Madison. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, deep breath, burying the successful business owner and bringing the naive, vulnerable grandfather back to the surface. I pressed the green button and held the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just waited. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of ragged, heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Then came the performance. Vincent. She sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. Vincent. I am so sorry to bother you. I know we have not spoken since the baby shower, and I feel just awful about how everything happened. Please tell me you have a few minutes to talk. I closed my eyes and leaned against the workbench. Her voice was dripping with a desperate, sugary sweetness that made my stomach turn. It was the exact same tone she used years ago when she convinced Brian to drop out of his master's degree program so they could move to a more fashionable city. It was the voice of a predator realizing her trap had suddenly sprung on her own leg. I kept my voice soft, injecting just the right amount of old age gravel into my words. I am here, Madison. What is wrong? The dam broke and a flood of meticulously crafted lies poured through the speaker. She told me that Brian had suddenly been laid off from his project management job. She cried about how the corporate world was so cruel, firing him without severance right before the baby was due. I knew for a fact Brian had not been fired. He was simply suffocating under his actual salary now that my secret subsidies were gone. But I let her spin her web. She went on to describe how the stress of the job loss was affecting her pregnancy. She talked about terrible cramps, sleepless nights, and the devastating fear that she might lose the baby. She painted a picture of absolute misery, casting herself as the tragic heroine and Brian as the helpless victim of a bad economy. She never once mentioned the bounced credit cards at the country club. She never mentioned the tripled mortgage payment on the townhouse they had no business living in. She only talked about survival. Then came the pivot. The emotional setup was complete, and she moved seamlessly into the financial ask. Vincent? She whispered, sounding as though she was holding back tears. We went to a specialist yesterday. The regular doctors are just not equipped to handle a high-risk pregnancy like mine. The specialist says I need immediate intensive prenatal care and a series of treatments that our terrible insurance will not cover. If we do not pay up front, they will not treat me. And I am so terrified for your grandson, Vincent. I am so scared. I stared at the wall of my garage, tracing the outline of a rusted hammer hanging on the pegboard. She was using my unborn grandson as collateral. She was weaponizing my love for my family to fund her lifestyle. It was a level of emotional blackmail so profound it almost impressed me. She knew exactly what strings to pull to make a grandfather open his wallet. In her mind, I was just a lonely old widower who would give everything he had to protect his family line. She assumed my isolation made me desperate for connection, and she was exploiting that assumed desperation with surgical precision. "How much do you need, Madison?" I asked, letting a note of tired resignation slip into my voice. She hesitated, playing the part of the reluctant beggar perfectly. "We need $30,000, Vincent. I know it is a massive amount of money. I know you live on a fixed income and you have your little pension. But we have nowhere else to turn. Brian is too proud to ask you, but I am begging you as a mother. Could you go to your bank? Could you take out a second mortgage on your house? The market is good right now. You could easily get a home equity loan. We would pay you back every single penny the moment Brian finds a new executive position. I promise you, Vincent, we will pay you back." She wanted me to risk the roof over my head to save her. She fully believed I was a poor, retired, blue-collar worker, and she was entirely willing to put me in crippling debt to maintain her facade. The sheer audacity of her request solidified my resolve. There was no going back. There was no saving her. There was only the execution of the trap. I let a long, heavy silence stretch over the phone line. I let her sweat. I could hear her sharp intakes of breath waiting for my answer. Finally, I spoke, making my voice sound old, weary, and deeply concerned. $30,000 is everything I have, Madison. That is my entire emergency fund. I will have to talk to the teller, see what kind of cashier's check they can write. It is not going to be easy." Madison exhaled a loud, shaky breath. The relief in her voice was immediate and sickening. "Oh, Vincent, thank you. Thank you so much. You are saving our lives. Can you do it today? Can you have the money transferred by tomorrow morning? The doctors are demanding payment by Friday." I shook my head even though she could not see me. "I cannot move that kind of cash overnight, Madison. The banks have rules for withdrawals that large. I need 48 hours to get the paperwork sorted and gather the funds. You tell the doctors you will have the money. Let me see what I can do." She thanked me profusely, her sugary tone completely restored. She even threw in a condescending comment about how she knew I would do the right thing for my family, despite our little misunderstanding at the townhouse. She actually called my exclusion from the baby shower a little misunderstanding. The arrogance was breathtaking. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. The silence returned to the garage, but the peace was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp energy. I did not go to the bank. I did not look into a home equity loan. Instead, I pulled out my secure smartphone, the one Alan had issued to me, and dialed a number I had not used in 6 years. It was the direct line to Philip, a private forensic accountant who used to audit corporate acquisitions for my freight company. Philip was ruthless, entirely discreet, and incredibly fast. When you pay a man a retainer for half a decade just to remain on call, he tends to answer quickly. Philip picked up on the first ring. "Philip," I said, leaning over my workbench and brushing the sawdust off my blueprints. "I have a domestic situation that requires your immediate attention. I need a full financial extraction on my daughter-in-law, Madison. I want to know every single transaction she has made in the last 90 days. I want her credit reports, her hidden accounts, and her debt-to-income ratios. Specifically, I am looking for a sudden deficit of exactly $30,000. Philip tapped his keyboard in the background. "Is there a business name attached to her?" he asked, his voice strictly professional. I gave him the name of her failing boutique startup. I also told him to pull the property records for the townhouse. I knew she was hiding something massive. A woman like Madison does not ask for $30,000 to pay medical bills. Women like Madison use the word medical because it is the only excuse that prevents people from asking too many questions. I knew the money was for something else, something desperate. I wanted to know if she had taken out any shadow loans, anything outside the traditional banking system. She was drowning, and she was thrashing around trying to find a lifeline. I needed to find out who threw her the rope. I want to know who she owes Philip. I continued, my voice echoing slightly in the large, empty garage. I want to know everything. Do not leave a single stone unturned. If she bought a cup of coffee last Tuesday, I want to see the receipt. Philip confirmed the instructions, promising a preliminary dossier within 24 hours. I ended the call and set the phone down next to the piece of mahogany. The trap was set. Madison thought she had successfully manipulated a lonely old man into surrendering his life savings. She thought she was going to take my money, pay off whatever secret disaster she had created, and go right back to ignoring my existence. She had no idea that she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her completely. I picked up my handplane, positioned it over the wood, and pushed forward. The blade bit into the mahogany, peeling away a perfect, unbroken ribbon. The real work had finally begun. I spent the next 24 hours working quietly in my garage. I did not turn on the radio. I did not watch television. I just sanded the mahogany rocking chair, letting the smooth, repetitive motion keep my mind entirely focused. At exactly 2 o'clock the following afternoon, my secure phone buzzed against the wooden workbench. Philip never missed a deadline. I wiped the sawdust from my hands, picked up the device, and pressed the green button. I did not bother with a greeting. I just asked him what he had found. Philip was a man who spoke entirely in facts and figures. He told me he had compiled a comprehensive dossier on Madison and her financial footprint. He said he had emailed the encrypted file to my tablet, but he wanted to walk me through the highlights immediately because the situation was far more volatile than either of us had anticipated. I opened the tablet, entered the security key, and watched the dense spreadsheets fill the screen. It was a digital map of absolute ruin. Philip started with the medical bills she had cried about on the phone. He told me he had checked every local hospital network, every private clinic, and every specialized prenatal care facility in the state. Madison did not have a single outstanding medical invoice. Her insurance through Brian had covered all her standard checkups, and there was no high-risk specialist on record. The entire story about needing $30,000 to save my unborn grandson was a complete fabrication. It was a calculated, sickening lie designed specifically to manipulate a lonely old man into draining his retirement account. Then Philip moved to the actual crisis. He told me Madison had been living in a state of financial freefall for months. Even with my secret subsidies keeping the roof over her townhouse, she had managed to max out 4 premium credit cards. But the true disaster, the reason she was suddenly desperate for $30,000 in cash, was a shadow loan she had taken out 3 weeks prior. Philip explained that when traditional banks cut her off due to her terrible credit score, she had turned to a high-risk predatory lending firm called Apex Capital Solutions. They specialized in short-term astronomical interest loans for desperate people trying to maintain the appearance of wealth. I stared at the glowing screen of my tablet, tracing the lines of data with my scarred finger. I asked Philip what on earth she could have possibly bought with a $30,000 predatory loan. I assumed she was trying to pay off a secret gambling debt, or perhaps trying to inject emergency cash into her failing boutique startup. Philip let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He told me to look at page 4 of the dossier. She used the money to throw the baby shower at the Oak Ridge Country Club. Philip said, his voice flat and clinical. The catering, the imported floral arrangements, the string quartet. It all cost exactly $18,000. I closed my eyes, picturing the live video I had watched in this very garage just a few weeks ago. I pictured the crystal champagne flutes and the wealthy friends she was so desperate to impress. She had gone to a loan shark to pay for a party, just so she could humiliate me by excluding me from it. But that still left $12,000 unaccounted for. I asked Philip where the rest of the money went. He directed my attention to a separate transaction line. 2 days before the baby shower, Madison had wired $11,500 to a luxury reseller in Paris. She had purchased an exclusive, rare Birkin handbag. She wanted to make sure she was holding the ultimate status symbol when she greeted her high society friends at the country club. She had mortgaged her family future and lied about the health of her unborn child so she could carry a piece of designer leather. The sheer vanity of it was almost difficult to comprehend. But as I looked at the loan documents, Philip had uncovered a very specific mathematical problem presented itself. I had spent my entire life dealing with corporate contracts and financial liabilities. I knew that a firm like Apex Capital Solutions did not just hand over $30,000 to an unemployed woman with a failing business and maxed out credit cards. They required collateral. They required something solid to seize when the borrower inevitably defaulted. I asked Philip what she used to secure the loan. The line went dead silent for a moment. This was the piece of information that changed everything. She leveraged the townhouse, Philip explained slowly. The loan is secured against the equity of the property. I shook my head, even though he could not see me. That is impossible, I said. Madison is not the primary name on that deed. Brian is the primary borrower. The bank would never allow a secondary equity lien without his explicit notarized authorization. And despite all of Brian's flaws, I knew my son was far too terrified of financial risk to sign away the roof over his head for a handbag and a party. Philip agreed with my assessment. That is exactly right, Vincent. Brian did not authorize it. I managed to pull the digital signature logs from the loan application. Madison submitted the paperwork electronically from her laptop, while Brian was out of town at a corporate conference last month. She used his digital signature stamp, bypassed the dual authentication by having the confirmation code sent to her own phone, and forged his consent on the primary lien documents. The words hung in the quiet air of my garage. Forgery. Wire fraud. She had committed multiple federal felonies to secure money she had already burned through. If she defaulted on the loan, Apex Capital would initiate an immediate hostile foreclosure on the townhouse, and when Brian tried to fight it, he would discover his own wife had fraudulently signed his name to the execution warrant. She needs the $30,000 from you by Friday, Philip continued, because that is the deadline for her first balloon payment. If she misses it, the interest rate quadruples, and Apex Capital legally notifies the primary borrower, which is Brian. She is terrified you will not give her the money, because if you do not, her husband finds out she committed a massive felony. I leaned back against the wooden workbench. The cold, empty feeling in my stomach was completely gone, replaced by a solid, heavy block of absolute certainty. Madison had handed me the keys to her own destruction. She had built a guillotine, positioned her own head beneath the blade, and was now begging me to pay for the rope holding it up. I thanked Philip for his exceptional work. I told him his retainer would be doubled for the quarter. Then I gave him one final, very specific instruction. Philip, I said, I want you to contact the managing partners at Apex Capital Solutions. I want you to negotiate the immediate outright purchase of Madison's debt portfolio. Use my holding company. I do not care what premium they demand. By the end of business today, I want to be her sole creditor. I want to own that loan. Philip did not ask questions. He simply confirmed the directive and ended the call. I set the tablet down next to the cherry wood crib I had built for my grandson. I looked at the fine craftsmanship, the honest labor poured into every single piece of wood. My grandson was going to be born into a world of incredible chaos, but I was going to ensure that the poison was entirely removed from his life before he ever learned to speak. Madison had called me a poor old man who did not fit her aesthetic. She had excluded me from her world because she thought I was useless. I picked up my phone and dialed Madison's number. She answered on the very first ring, her voice breathless and frantic, asking if I had gone to the bank yet. I let a warm, comforting tone slide perfectly into my voice. I told her I had wonderful news. I told her I had spoken to the bank manager, and despite the large amount they were willing to pull together, the $30,000 for my grandson's medical treatments. I heard her let out a massive, shuddering sob of relief. She started thanking me repeatedly, calling me the greatest grandfather in the world, telling me how much she loved me. I let her speak. I let her bathe in the absolute relief of thinking she had gotten away with her crimes. Then I told her there was just one small condition. I told her I wanted to hand the cashier's check over in person, but I wanted to do it properly. I wanted to see the baby's nursery, and I wanted to celebrate with her and Brian at the big sip and see brunch event she was hosting for her friends this coming Sunday. She tried to argue. She tried to say the country club brunch was too loud, and she just wanted to handle the money privately. But I held firm. I told her that if she wanted my life savings, she was going to have to accept it from my hands in front of everyone at the exact same country club where she had declared I did not fit in. She had no choice. She was trapped by her own impending default. She swallowed her pride and agreed to let me come. I hung up the phone and smiled in the quiet garage. The trap was locked. The following morning, I dressed carefully for my performance. I chose my most faded pair of denim jeans and a flannel shirt that was fraying at the collar. I wanted to look exactly like the pathetic, easily manipulated Mark Madison believed me to be. I practiced my posture in the bathroom mirror, letting my shoulders slump forward, putting a slight tremor in my hands, and practicing the wide-eyed, confused look of an old man completely overwhelmed by the modern world. Inside my breast pocket, I placed a thick white envelope. It did not contain a $30,000 cashier's check. It contained a stack of blank printer paper cut to the exact size and weight of bank documents. It was the bait, and I was about to walk right into the lioness den to see how hungry she really was. I drove the Ford truck back to their gated community. The security guard at the front gate recognized my rusted bumper and waved me through with a look of mild amusement. When I pulled into the driveway of the glass and steel townhouse, I noticed Madison's luxury vehicle was parked slightly crooked, the front tire resting on the manicured grass. It was a small detail, but it told me everything I needed to know about her current state of mind. The perfectly composed socialite was unraveling. I walked up the concrete steps and pressed the doorbell. I waited a full minute before I heard the rapid, heavy clicking of heels against the hardwood floor inside. The door swung open, and Madison stood in the frame. The transformation was startling. Just a few weeks ago, at the baby shower, she had looked like a glowing, polished magazine model. Today, the cracks in the porcelain were fully visible. Her blonde hair was tied back in a messy knot. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her silk blouse was wrinkled. She looked like a woman who had not slept in days, a woman who knew the executioner was sharpening his blade. When she saw me standing there in my work boots, she forced a smile onto her face. It was a grotesque, unnatural expression that did not reach her panicked eyes. "Oh, Vincent," she said, her voice tight and breathy. "You are here. Come in quickly. Just please take off your boots. The cleaners were just here, and I cannot deal with mud on the floors right now." I did as she asked, playing the obedient, intimidated father-in-law. I stepped out of my boots and walked into the foyer in my thick wool socks. The house felt different today. The illusion of effortless wealth had evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, frantic energy. I shuffled slowly toward the living room, making a show of looking around in awe at the high ceilings and the expensive modern art on the walls. Madison did not offer me a seat. She did not offer me a glass of water. She stood in the center of the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, tapping her foot against the floorboards. She was vibrating with nervous anticipation. "Well," she asked, her fake smile straining at the edges. "Did you go to the bank? Did you talk to the manager like we discussed on the phone?" I let out a long, heavy sigh and sank down onto the edge of the white leather sofa as if my bones were simply too tired to support me. I began to ramble, perfectly executing the role of the confused elderly man. I told her the bank was so crowded and the teller asked me so many confusing questions. I talked about how they made me sign 3 different forms to authorize the withdrawal of my life savings and how I had to sit in the manager's office for 2 hours while they verified my identity. I dragged the story out, watching her anxiety spike with every pointless detail I added. Madison ran a hand through her hair, her patience entirely evaporating. "Vincent, please," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "I do not care about the bank lines. I do not care about the forms. Did you get the money or not?" I reached into the breast pocket of my frayed flannel shirt and slowly pulled out the thick white envelope. I held it in my lap, resting my trembling hands over it. "I did, Madison," I said softly, looking up at her with manufactured vulnerability. "It took everything I had, but I got the cashier's check. $30,000. Madison's eyes locked onto the white envelope. The relief that washed over her face was so intense it was almost frightening. The fake sweetness returned instantly, washing away her irritation. "Oh, Vincent," she breathed, taking a step toward me. "You have no idea what this means. You are literally saving us. You are saving your grandson. Hand it here, I need to deposit it before the banks close at 4 o'clock. She reached out her hand, expecting me to simply hand over my life savings without a second thought. She was treating me like an automated machine that had finally dispensed the cash she demanded. As her manicured fingers reached for the paper, I slid the envelope back into my pocket and stood up from the sofa. Madison froze, her hand suspended in the empty air. Her eyes darted from my pocket to my face, panic instantly flaring back to life. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp and demanding. "Give me the check, Vincent. I told you the doctors need to be paid today." I shook my head slowly, looking deeply wounded by her tone. "Now hold on a minute, Madison," I said, keeping my voice gentle and slightly pathetic. "This is my entire emergency fund. This is the money I was saving for a nursing home in case my health fails. I am happy to give it to my family, I truly am. But I want to do this right." "Do what right?" she practically yelled, her facade crumbling completely. "Just give me the envelope." I took a step back, clutching my chest as if she had startled me. I told her I wanted to give the money to her and Brian together. I said I wanted to feel like a real part of this family, especially after missing the baby shower. I looked around the room and asked where Brian was. Madison gritted her teeth, her jaw muscles twitching visibly. "Brian is at the office," she lied smoothly. "He is trying to negotiate a severance package. He will not be home until late. Just give me the check, Vincent, and I will tell him everything you did for us. I promise." I shook my head again, more firmly this time. "No, Madison," I said, my voice wavering just enough to sound stubborn but harmless. "I am not handing over $30,000 in an empty living room. I want to see the nursery you built for my grandson. I want to celebrate this baby properly. On the phone you said I could come to your brunch this Sunday. I want to hand this envelope to both of you together at the party." Madison looked like she was about to explode. The veins in her neck were standing out. She took a deep breath, trying desperately to regain control of the situation. "Vincent, that brunch is just for my girlfriends and some business partners. It is going to be loud and it is going to be crowded. It is not the right place for financial transactions. Please do not be difficult. Just give me the money now. We can do a private dinner next week." I looked at her with wide, innocent eyes. "But Madison, you told me I did not fit in at the baby shower. You said I ruined the aesthetic. I just want a chance to prove I can be a good grandfather in front of your friends. If I am giving you my life savings, the least you can do is let me attend the brunch and see the nursery. If that is too much to ask, then maybe I should just take this money back to the bank." I turned my back to her and took a step toward the foyer, pretending I was ready to walk out the door and take her salvation with me. "Wait!" Madison screamed, her voice cracking with absolute desperation. I stopped but did not turn around. I listened to the sound of her heavy, ragged breathing. She was trapped. She needed that money to pay the predatory lenders before her balloon payment defaulted and the loan sharks foreclosed on the townhouse. She had no other options, no other victims to bleed dry. "Fine," she whispered, the word sounding like poison in her mouth. "Fine, Vincent. You can come to the brunch on Sunday. You can see the nursery. Just promise me you will bring the check." I turned around and offered her a warm, grandfatherly smile. "I promise, Madison," I said gently. "I will bring exactly what you deserve." I walked to the foyer, slipped my heavy work boots back on, and walked out the front door. As I climbed into my truck, I saw Madison watching me through the front window, her eyes fixed on my breast pocket. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully manipulated the foolish old man one last time. She had absolutely no idea that the envelope in my pocket was filled with blank paper, and that by Sunday I would officially own the massive debt that was about to destroy her entirely. I pulled out of the gated community, the heavy engine of my old Ford truck rumbling powerfully beneath me. The image of Madison standing behind her pristine front window, her desperate eyes practically burning a hole through my faded flannel shirt pocket, was permanently etched into my mind. She thought she had outsmarted a foolish old man. She thought the thick, white envelope resting against my chest held her ultimate salvation. I drove straight past the highway exit that led back to the quiet comfort of my own neighborhood. Instead, I steered the truck back toward the towering glass buildings of the downtown financial district. I had a promise to keep, and I needed the absolute legal authority to back it up. I dialed Alan Croft using the hands-free system in my truck. He answered immediately, his voice calm and professional. I told him Philip had found the massive leak in my daughter's-in-law financial boat. I explained the entire situation from start to finish. I detailed the forged digital signatures, the $30,000 predatory loan she had secured from Apex Capital Solutions, and the catastrophic balloon payment that was due by the close of business tomorrow. Even Alan, a man who had spent 3 decades navigating the darkest corners of corporate greed, was stunned by the sheer audacity of the wire fraud. I told him I did not just want to anonymously pay off the loan to save my son from the fallout. I wanted to buy the entire debt portfolio outright. I wanted my holding company to take immediate physical possession of the secondary equity lien on their townhouse. Alan warned me that purchasing toxic debt from a shadow lender was an incredibly messy and expensive process. I told him I did not care about the mess or the premium they would charge. I gave him a direct order to authorize the transfer pay, whatever exorbitant fee Apex Capital demanded, and have the physical documents printed and ready for my signature by the time I reached his office. I parked in the underground garage for the second time that week, bypassing the confused valet and walking straight into the private elevator. When I stepped into the sprawling corner office, Philip was already there, sitting next to Alan. They had a stack of dense, intimidating legal documents spread across the polished mahogany desk. Philip looked up from his tablet and told me that the managers at Apex Capital were more than happy to offload the debt. Madison was classified in their system as an extreme flight risk borrower. She had 0 verifiable income, 4 maxed-out credit cards, and her boutique business was officially failing. The loan sharks knew they would eventually have to go through a lengthy, expensive, hostile foreclosure process to get their money back. When my corporate holding company offered to buy her paper at a 20% premium, they finalized the digital transfer in less than an hour. I took a seat in the heavy leather chair facing the desk. Alan pushed the final transfer agreement toward me. He explained the severe reality of what we were doing. By signing this document, he said I was officially assuming all rights, privileges, and legal authorities of the original predatory lender. I was no longer just Vincent, the disappointed grandfather. I was the primary creditor for the property where my son slept every single night. If the balloon payment was not met by the Friday deadline, I had the absolute legal authority to trigger an immediate default and seize the asset. I picked up the heavy gold pen sitting on the edge of the desk. I did not hesitate for a single second. I signed my name on the dotted line. The ink dried and the trap was permanently sealed. Philip then reached into his briefcase and handed me the original loan application that Apex Capital had surrendered to us as part of the acquisition. I looked down at the digital signature line. There it was. My son's name perfectly typed and verified but entirely forged by the woman he married. Beside the signature was the formal notice of impending default, clearly stating the catastrophic financial penalties and legal actions that would activate if the Friday deadline was missed. Staring at that piece of paper, a cold realization washed over me. Madison had not just risked their home. She had committed multiple federal felonies, including wire fraud and identity theft, to buy a designer handbag and fund a lavish party. If this went to the authorities, she would face years in a federal penitentiary. I felt a brief pang of sorrow for Brian, realizing the absolute devastation he was about to experience. But then I remembered him standing silently in that living room, refusing to defend me while his wife kicked me out of their lives because of my aesthetic. Brian had chosen his bed, and now he was going to watch it burn to the ground. I took the thick white envelope out of my flannel shirt pocket. I reached inside and pulled out the stack of blank printer paper I had used to trick Madison into thinking I had a cashier's check. I threw the blank paper into the trash can beside the desk. Then I took the forged loan application and the official default notice, folded them carefully, and slid them into the envelope. This was the exact gift I was going to bring to the country club brunch. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological discipline. I returned to my garage and worked quietly on the rocking chair. Friday came and went without a single word. At exactly 5:00 in the afternoon, the deadline for the balloon payment officially passed. Technically and legally, Madison was now in default. My phone began to ring incessantly early Saturday morning. It was Madison. She was completely panicked. I let it ring to voicemail 3 times before I finally answered. The moment the line connected, she started speaking a mile a minute. Her voice was shaking with absolute terror. She told me she had received an automated notification email from Apex Capital stating that her loan had been unexpectedly transferred to a private holding company and that her payment was officially marked as late. She was terrified that these new unknown creditors were going to send lawyers to seize the house before she could get the $30,000 from me on Sunday. She begged me to tell her that the bank had actually cleared the cashier's check. She asked if I could just drive over right now and give her the money so she could wire it to the new holding company and stop the default process. I kept my voice incredibly calm, injecting just the right amount of grandfatherly sweetness into my tone. I told her to take a deep breath. I told her the bank had fully cleared the funds and the envelope was sitting right on my kitchen table ready for tomorrow. I told her not to worry about whatever confusing administrative emails she was getting from those lenders. I promised her that by the end of the brunch on Sunday, all of her financial troubles would be completely over, and everyone in her circle would know exactly how her bills were being paid. She let out a massive, shuddering sigh of relief. She was so blinded by her own arrogance and entitlement that she completely missed the double meaning in my words. She thanked me profusely, calling me an absolute lifesaver, entirely unaware that she was speaking directly to the man who now owned her debt. I hung up the phone and looked across the garage at the cherrywood crib. She was about to host the most expensive, exclusive party of her entire life, completely oblivious to the fact that she no longer owned the floor she was standing on. Sunday morning arrived bright and clear. I woke up early, drank a cup of black coffee, and prepared for the execution of the trap. I did not put on a suit. I did not try to look wealthy. I put on my oldest, most faded pair of work boots, the exact same boots she had demanded I take off at her front door. I slipped into my heavy denim jeans and a simple cotton shirt. I picked up the white envelope containing her ruin, placed it securely in my pocket, and walked out to my old Ford truck. It was time to go to the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was time to show her friends exactly what kind of aesthetic funded their champagne. The drive to the Oak Ridge Country Club took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing an invisible border between 2 entirely different worlds. I drove my old Ford truck past the towering wrought iron gates, ignoring the confused stare of the security guard in his pristine uniform. The driveway was a long, winding path, lined with ancient oak trees and perfectly manicured hedges. I pulled up to the main clubhouse, which was a massive colonial structure with towering white pillars and sweeping verandas. The valet stand was crowded with imported luxury sedans and high-end sports cars. When I put my truck in park, the engine let out a loud sputtering cough that echoed across the quiet, elegant courtyard. A young valet in a crisp white vest rushed forward, looking at my rusted bumper as if it were a diseased animal. I stepped out of the truck, my heavy work boots hitting the cobblestone pavement with a dull thud. I handed the kid my keys, gave him a polite nod, and walked toward the grand entrance. I was wearing my most faded denim jeans and a plain cotton shirt that had seen years of sawdust and hard labor. The thick white envelope was resting securely in my front pocket. Every step I took felt heavy with absolute purpose. The interior of the clubhouse was a monument to excess. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the immaculate marble floors. I followed the ornate brass signs directing guests to the private conservatory for the sip and see brunch. As I approached the massive double doors, the sound of a live string quartet drifted down the hallway, mingling with the high-pitched laughter of wealthy socialites. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the room. It was a sea of soft pastel colors, designer floral arrangements, and incredibly expensive silk dresses. Waiters in black ties glided smoothly through the crowd, carrying silver trays of mimosas and miniature pastries. In the center of the room, surrounded by a mountain of impeccably wrapped gifts, stood Madison. She was wearing a flowing white maternity dress, holding my newborn grandson, wrapped in a pristine cashmere blanket. She was laughing loudly at a joke made by the wife of a prominent real estate developer, playing the role of the perfect, flawless mother to absolute perfection. Brian was standing a few feet away, holding a crystal champagne flute. He looked pale, exhausted, and completely detached from the lavish celebration happening all around him. He looked like a man standing blindly on a trapdoor, just waiting for the heavy lever to be pulled. I stood near the entrance for a long moment, simply watching them. I watched the fake smiles and the hollow compliments being exchanged. I watched my son drowning in a life he could not possibly afford. Then Madison turned her head and saw me standing there. The joyful laughter died in her throat instantly. The vibrant color drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and terrified. For a split second, the carefully constructed mask slipped entirely, and I saw the desperate cornered animal hiding beneath the expensive designer clothes. She quickly handed my grandson to one of her wealthy friends, forcing a tight plastic smile onto her face. She muttered a quick excuse to the group before practically sprinting across the crowded room toward me. She did not greet me warmly. She did not ask how I was doing. She grabbed my arm with surprising vicious force, her manicured fingernails digging sharply into my cotton shirt. She immediately tried to pull me back out into the quiet hallway, away from the prying eyes of her high society guests. "What are you doing standing out here in the open?" She hissed, her voice barely a whisper, but vibrating with absolute fury. "I told you to wait by the coat check near the lobby. Look at what you are wearing, Vincent. You smell like an old, dusty garage. You cannot be seen standing in here." I let her pull me a few steps back into the corridor, playing the part of the bewildered and intimidated old man. I told her I just wanted to see the new baby and say a quick hello to Brian. I reminded her of our agreement from the other day, that I was supposed to be a real part of this celebration if I was bringing my life savings. Madison looked around the hallway, frantically terrified that one of her wealthy friends might walk out and see her standing with a man who looked like a common laborer. She stepped uncomfortably close to me, her expensive floral perfume poorly masking the sour smell of her nervous sweat. "I do not have time for this ridiculous game, Vincent," she demanded. "My friends are waiting for me inside. Brian is busy networking with the senior partners from his firm. Just give me the envelope right now so you can leave quietly. You kept your promise, you showed up now. Give me the money before you ruin my entire afternoon." I looked down at her, letting my shoulders slump perfectly, mimicking the defeated posture of a man who realized he was entirely unwanted by his own family. I reached up and tapped the front pocket of my shirt right where the thick white envelope was resting against my chest. "I brought it, Madison," I said softly. "I brought everything you need to solve all of your terrible problems. But I am not handing it over in a dark, empty hallway like it is some sort of dirty secret. This is my entire emergency fund. I am going to walk into that room, I am going to look at my grandson, and I am going to give this money to my son in front of everyone." Madison looked like she was about to suffer a stroke right there on the carpet. Her eyes darted wildly, calculating the massive risk. She needed that $30,000 to pay the predatory lenders before the close of business tomorrow. She knew if she caused a massive screaming scene right here in the hallway, I might walk away with nothing, and the loan sharks would immediately foreclose on her pristine townhouse. She was entirely trapped by the weight of her own blinding greed. "Fine," she gritted out, her voice dripping with pure venom and hatred. "Fine. But you do not speak to anyone in that room. You do not talk about your blue-collar pension or your ridiculous woodworking hobbies. You walk straight in, you hand Brian the envelope, you look at the baby for 1 minute, and you leave immediately. Do you understand me?" I nodded slowly, offering her a warm, perfectly compliant smile. "I understand perfectly, Madison," I said. "I will not say a single word about my pension." I brushed her tight grip off my arm, turned around, and walked purposefully back through the double doors into the bright, opulent conservatory. Madison followed closely behind me, her entire body rigid with absolute panic. I ignored the confused, condescending stares of the socialites as I cut straight through the middle of the room, my heavy work boots stomping loudly against the polished marble floor. I was walking directly toward my son, and the heavy tension in the room thickened with every single step I took. The cheerful music from the string quartet seemed to fade entirely into the background. The trap was finally ready to spring. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely. The sudden absence of the cheerful classical music left a heavy, suffocating vacuum in the massive conservatory. The only sound was the dull, heavy thud of my work boots against the pristine imported marble floor. I stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Brian. My son looked as though the floor beneath him had suddenly turned to glass and was cracking under his weight. His eyes darted nervously from my faded flannel shirt and sawdust-covered jeans to the perfectly manicured faces of the wealthy investors standing around him. He was completely paralyzed by the sudden violent collision of his two worlds. The father he was so ashamed of, the man he allowed to be excluded from his life because I lacked the proper aesthetic, was now standing right in the center of the lavish illusion he could not afford. I did not spare a single glance for the socialites or the real estate developers whispering behind their champagne flutes. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Brian. I saw the dark, heavy circles under his eyes, the pale, clammy texture of his skin, and the slight tremor in his hands. It was the undeniable physical toll of the financial drought I had engineered. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat seemed completely dry. No words came out, no. He just stared in silent horror at the thick white envelope protruding from my front pocket. I raised my voice, making sure it was loud enough to carry across the dead silence of the room. I wanted every single person in that conservatory, the women who judged me, and the men who funded Madison, to hear exactly what I had to say. I looked Brian up and down and told him I was incredibly sorry to interrupt his elegant party. I said I knew I was not on the special guest list, but Madison had made it perfectly clear to me on the phone that this was an absolute life-or-death emergency. I said the words life or death with a heavy, deliberate emphasis, letting them echo off the vaulted ceilings. Brian blinked rapidly, his confusion momentarily overriding his embarrassment. He slowly lowered his crystal champagne flute, his brow furrowing in deep bewilderment. He asked me what on earth I was talking about. His voice cracked slightly, betraying his immense stress. He said there was no emergency and asked why I was dressed in my work clothes at their formal brunch. I let out a long, weary sigh, executing the role of the exhausted but deeply devoted grandfather to absolute perfection. I told him I had rushed over as quickly as I could because his wife had called me sobbing hysterically just 2 days ago. I told him I had gone to the bank and drained my entire life savings to bring him the $30,000 they so desperately needed to survive the week. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy guests. $30,000 was not a massive sum to people who regularly bought luxury yachts or second homes, but hearing that the flawless, confident hostess was secretly begging her blue-collar father-in-law for emergency cash completely shattered the illusion of her wealth. The social currency Madison valued more than her own family evaporated instantly. Madison materialized beside me like a ghost. She was practically vibrating with a terrifying mixture of rage and panic. She let out a loud, shrill laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. She turned to her wealthy friends and waved her hand dismissively, flashing a manic, terrifying smile. She told them her father-in-law was just terribly confused. She said I was getting old and my memory was starting to fail, claiming I had completely misunderstood a simple, casual conversation about buying nursery furniture. She reached out and tried to grab my arm again, digging her sharp, manicured nails deeply into my wrist. She was desperate to physically drag me toward the exit before I could say another word. She leaned in close and whispered through gritted teeth, demanding that I shut my mouth and hand over the envelope right that second. But I did not move a single inch. I planted my heavy boots firmly on the marble floor, establishing myself as an immovable object in the center of her fragile world. I looked down at her terrified, angry face. I told her I was not confused in the slightest. I told her my memory was absolutely perfect, and I remembered every single detail of her desperate phone call. I turned my attention back to my son, ignoring Madison entirely. I looked Brian dead in the eyes and asked him how his wife's intensive medical treatments were going. I asked him if the expensive high-risk specialist had been able to secure the prenatal care she needed to save my unborn grandson. Brian looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a marble statue. He looked at Madison, then slowly turned his gaze back to me. He shook his head slowly. He told me Madison was not high risk. He said her pregnancy was perfectly healthy, and her corporate insurance plan covered every single routine appointment. He asked me in a shaking voice who on earth had told me she needed $30,000 for medical bills. I raised my hand and pointed a calloused, scarred finger directly at the woman standing beside him. I told him his wife had called me crying, begging me to take out a second mortgage on my home to pay for intensive emergency treatments. I told him she said the doctors were threatening to drop her care if she did not pay up front. I let the silence hang for a second before delivering the next blow. I told Brian she had also cried about how he had suddenly lost his job and how they were drowning in unpayable debt right before the baby was due. The silence in the room became so heavy, it felt difficult to breathe. The guests were staring in shock, completely captivated by the absolute destruction of their friend's reputation. Brian slowly turned his entire body to face his wife. The sheer confusion on his face was rapidly transforming into genuine soul-crushing horror. He knew he had not lost his job, even though his secret bonuses had mysteriously vanished from his bank account. He knew they had absolutely no medical debt. He stared at Madison, asking her in a low, trembling voice what she had done. Madison took a step back, her chest heaving violently as she struggled to draw oxygen into her lungs. The flawless, arrogant socialite who had deemed me unfit to attend her baby shower was completely gone. In her place was a terrified, cornered woman caught in a massive, devastating lie in front of the only people whose opinions she actually valued. She tried to stammer out an excuse. She tried to say I was twisting her words, that I was a bitter old man who had misunderstood a request for a small temporary loan to help with the catering expenses for the brunch. But her voice cracked terribly, and the raw, undeniable panic in her wide eyes betrayed her completely. She looked at the faces of her friends seeking any sign of support or belief. But the women from her yoga studio and the country club board were looking at her with thinly veiled disgust. In their world, running out of money was a tragedy. But lying about a pregnancy to extort money from a blue-collar grandfather was an unforgivable social crime. They stepped back physically, distancing themselves from the imploding woman. Brian demanded an answer, his voice rising in volume and intensity. He asked her again why she had asked his father for $30,000. He asked her what she could possibly need that amount of cash for, especially since their credit cards had been declining all week. The pieces were finally starting to connect in his mind, but he was still missing the most crucial, devastating piece of the puzzle. He did not know about the forged signature. He did not know about the predatory loan. He only knew his wife was a liar. Madison began to cry real, genuine tears of absolute terror. She reached out to touch Brian's arm, but he recoiled violently, stepping away from her as if she were carrying a contagious disease. She sobbed uncontrollably, begging him to let her explain, begging him to believe that she was just trying to maintain their lifestyle so he would not be stressed. She blamed the economy. She blamed the pressure of society. She blamed everyone but herself. I stood there watching the entire pathetic display, feeling absolutely nothing. The emotional detachment I had achieved in my garage held perfectly firm. I was not a father trying to save his son anymore. I was simply the architect of the truth, and the truth was about to become infinitely more painful. The opulent setting of the conservatory made the ugliness of the moment even more profound. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a bright, unforgiving light on Madison's tear-stained face. The towering arrangements of imported white roses seemed to mock the absolute decay of her marriage. I watched Brian run a trembling hand through his hair, completely overwhelmed. For years he had allowed this woman to dictate his reality. He had let her isolate him from the man who raised him simply because I preferred denim over tailored suits. Now the absolute frailty of his chosen life was exposed for everyone to see. He looked around the room, seeing the judgment and pity in the eyes of his supposed peers. The realization that his entire social standing was nothing more than a carefully constructed house of cards hit him with physical force. He looked back at me, his eyes pleading for some sort of explanation, asking silently if this was some kind of terrible misunderstanding. But my expression remained entirely stony and unyielding. I told Brian I did not come here to listen to her make excuses. I told him I did not drive across town in my old truck to be paraded around as a senile fool. I came here because a promise is a promise. I looked at Madison, who was still sobbing frantically into her hands. I told her I had brought exactly what she asked for. I reached my hand up and rested my fingers against the thick white envelope protruding from my front pocket. Madison stopped crying for a fraction of a second, her greedy instincts momentarily overriding her terror. She stared at the pocket, hoping against hope that despite the public humiliation, I was still foolish enough to hand over the money to save her from the loan sharks. She thought the worst part of her day was the embarrassment. She still firmly believed the envelope contained a cashier's check that would make her massive, terrifying debt disappear. She had absolutely no idea that the real destruction was only just beginning. I slowly reached my calloused hand into the front pocket of my faded flannel shirt. The absolute silence in the massive conservatory was deafening. Every single pair of eyes in the room was completely locked onto my movements. I could hear the sharp, ragged sound of Madison drawing in a breath and holding it. She was staring at my chest with a look of pure, unadulterated hunger. Even after being exposed as a liar in front of her most important friends, she still firmly believed she was going to walk away with my life savings. She thought the social humiliation was the final price she had to pay. She was bracing herself to snatch the cashier's check run to the bank and wipe away the massive predatory loan before anyone discovered the true depths of her criminal behavior. I pulled the thick white envelope out of my pocket. It felt heavy in my hands. Madison took a tiny, involuntary step forward, her manicured fingers twitching at her sides. I did not hand it to her. I did not even look at her. I kept my eyes entirely focused on my son. Brian was standing perfectly still, his face completely drained of color, looking like a man waiting for the firing squad to pull their triggers. I lifted the flap of the envelope and reached inside. Madison let out a soft, desperate whimpering sound, expecting to see the familiar green and gold paper of a certified bank check. Instead, I pulled out 4 thick pages of legal-sized paper. They were covered in dense black text, official red stamps, and digital barcodes. The moment Madison saw the legal documents, the hungry anticipation in her eyes was instantly replaced by a look of sheer, blinding terror. She recognized the thick ivory paper immediately. She knew exactly what I was holding. I unfolded the documents slowly, making sure the crisp rustle of the thick paper echoed clearly across the quiet marble room. I held the first page up, holding it by the corners, so the bright golden light from the crystal chandeliers illuminated the bold black header printed at the top. I read the name of the firm out loud, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. Apex Capital Solutions, I announced. A shadow lending firm specializing in high-interest predatory loans for desperate borrowers. The wealthy socialites standing around us exchanged confused, bewildered glances. They were women who dealt with massive trust funds and elite wealth management firms. They did not understand why the flawless hostess of a $20,000 country club brunch would have any connection to a predatory loan shark. I looked around the room, taking in the towering displays of imported white roses, the crystal champagne flutes, and the towering chocolate fountain. I told the crowd of silent guests that they were currently standing inside a $30,000 lie. I told them I did not bring a check to pay for non-existent medical bills. I brought the undeniable proof of exactly how Madison had funded her fake reality. I looked down at the first page of the loan document and read the numbers out loud. I told the room that exactly 3 weeks ago, Madison had taken out a toxic $30,000 cash advance. I pointed my finger at the silver trays of miniature pastries and the hired string quartet standing awkwardly in the corner. I told them that $18,000 of that shadow loan went directly to the Oak Ridge Country Club to pay for this exact party. I explained that she had mortgaged her family's entire future just so she could stand in this room and pretend to belong among them. A wave of absolute disgust washed over the crowd of guests. The women who had been laughing and drinking with her just 10 minutes ago physically recoiled. The social currency Madison worshipped had completely evaporated. In their eyes, she was no longer a wealthy peer. She was a pathetic, desperate fraud who was playing dress-up with loan shark money. Then I turned my attention to the gift table. Sitting right in the center, surrounded by silver wrapping paper, was a pristine white leather designer handbag. I pointed directly at it. I told the room that 2 days before the baby shower, Madison had wired $11,500 to a private luxury reseller in Paris, just to secure that exact bag. I looked at Madison, who was trembling so violently, she looked like she might shatter into a million pieces. I asked her if the soft imported leather was worth the absolute destruction of her family. She could not answer. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. She was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her public exposure. But the absolute worst part of the execution was still waiting to be delivered. I turned back to Brian. My son was staring at the legal documents in my hands with a look of profound, sickening realization. He knew they did not have the cash flow to support the party or the handbag. He knew the money had to come from somewhere, but he also knew the fundamental rules of lending. He knew a predatory firm like Apex Capital would never hand over $30,000 to an unemployed woman with maxed-out credit cards unless they had an ironclad guarantee. I looked Brian dead in the eyes and asked him a very simple question. I asked him if he remembered signing away the equity of his townhouse. Brian physically staggered backward as if I had just punched him in the chest. He shook his head wildly, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He told me he never signed anything. He said the townhouse was in his name and he would never authorize a secondary lien against their primary residence. His voice was cracking. breaking under the immense weight of the betrayal he was finally beginning to understand. I nodded slowly, acknowledging his truth. I told him I knew he did not sign it. I flipped to the third page of the legal packet and held it out toward him. I told him to look at the bottom of the page. I told him to look at the digital signature stamp that had authorized the transfer of his home equity to the loan sharks. Brian leaned forward, his whole body shaking, and looked at the black ink on the page. It was his name, his exact digital authorization code. He looked up at me, completely devastated, asking how this was possible. I did not lower my voice. I wanted the entire room to hear the exact nature of the crimes committed. I told Brian that while he was out of town at his corporate conference last month, his wife had logged into his secure laptop. I explained that she had initiated the loan application, used his digital signature stamp, and bypassed the dual authentication security protocol by having the bank confirmation code routed directly to her own cell phone. I let the words hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. I looked at the wealthy investors and the real estate developers standing in the crowd. I knew they understood the severe legal implications of what I had just described. I looked back at my son and delivered the final crushing definition of his wife's actions. I told Brian she did not just take out a bad loan. I told him she committed wire fraud. I told him she committed identity theft. I told him his wife had committed multiple federal felonies, forging his legal consent to hand over the roof over his head to a group of predatory lenders just so she could buy a purse and a plate of expensive appetizers. The reaction from Brian was not explosive anger. It was a complete structural collapse of his entire spirit. He dropped his crystal champagne flute. The expensive glass hit the marble floor and shattered into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He looked at Madison with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. He did not see his wife anymore. He saw a stranger who had actively plotted to destroy his life behind his back. Madison finally snapped. The absolute reality of her situation shattered her paralyzed state. The secret was out. The felonies were exposed. Her husband looked at her with pure hatred, and her wealthy friends were already edging toward the double doors, desperate to escape the toxic fallout of her crimes. Her pristine, carefully curated world had burned to the ground in less than 5 minutes. She let out a piercing, guttural scream. It was not a cry of sadness. It was the primal, terrifying sound of an ego being completely ripped apart. She threw herself forward, her expensive silk maternity dress twisting violently around her legs. She lunged directly at me, her arms outstretched, her manicured fingernails aimed like claws at the legal documents in my hands. She was entirely consumed by the blinding, irrational desire to physically destroy the paper, as if tearing the documents into pieces would magically undo the reality of her federal crimes. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I simply took one calm, calculated step to the left. Madison was moving entirely on blind momentum. When I stepped out of her path, she had nothing to grab onto. Her smooth leather designer shoes found absolutely no traction on the highly polished marble floor. Her feet slipped out from under her. She crashed heavily onto her hands and knees, sliding straight into the pile of shattered crystal from Brian's dropped champagne flute. She let out a sharp cry of pain as the broken glass bit into her palms and her bare knees. She collapsed onto the cold marble, weeping hysterically, her perfect hair falling in a tangled mess around her tear-stained face. She was completely broken, kneeling on the floor of the most exclusive country club in the city, surrounded by the ruins of her own arrogance. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity. I reached into the back of the legal packet and pulled out the final piece of paper. It was printed on bright yellow paper with bold red lettering at the top. I stepped carefully around the broken glass and held the yellow paper up so Brian could see it clearly. I told them the story was not quite over. I explained that predatory loans come with incredibly strict deadlines. I told them the balloon payment for the $30,000 was officially due yesterday afternoon at exactly 5 o'clock. I looked down at Madison, who was sobbing into her bleeding hands. I told the entire room that Madison had missed the deadline. I announced that the loan was officially in default as of yesterday evening. I looked at Brian and told him the terrifying truth about his living situation. I told him the loan sharks had already activated the penalty clauses. I told him the townhouse was gone. The hostile foreclosure process was automatically triggered the moment the clock struck 5. Madison choked on her own tears, desperately trying to catch her breath. She looked up at me from the floor, her face smeared with mascara and blood. She begged me to stop. She told me I had to fix it. She screamed that I had the money in my bank account, and I had to pay them right now before they took the house. I stared down at her, my expression completely cold and unyielding. I folded the legal documents and tapped them against the palm of my hand. I told her she was absolutely right about one thing. I told her someone did have the power to stop the foreclosure. But I told her it was not going to be me because I did not bring a check. I brought the notice of default to inform her that a new corporate holding company had purchased her debt entirely. She was no longer dealing with unknown loan sharks. She was dealing with someone who knew exactly who she was. Hak Kong Tu Danai. Madison was still kneeling on the cold marble floor, surrounded by the shattered pieces of crystal. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving, as she stared up at me. She had just realized that the faceless loan sharks she thought she could outsmart had been replaced by a massive corporate entity. But she still did not understand that I was the entity. She thought I was just the messenger delivering the bad news, because she still viewed me as a poor, uneducated laborer. She reached out her bleeding hands, begging me to call the bank to see if the $30,000 could still be wired to stop the foreclosure. She was completely trapped in her own delusion, entirely unable to comprehend that the old man she had banished from her life was the architect of her current destruction. Before I could even offer a response, the heavy wooden double doors of the conservatory swung open. The sound echoed loudly through the silent room, drawing the attention of every single wealthy guest. 2 men walked through the grand entrance, stepping onto the pristine marble floor. The first man was Alan Croft. He was wearing an impeccably tailored dark navy suit. His silver hair perfectly styled, projecting an aura of absolute corporate authority. He looked like exactly what he was, which was one of the most ruthless and expensive wealth management attorneys in the state. Beside him was a large, broad-shouldered man wearing a simple gray suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. The crowd of socialites and real estate developers immediately parted, forming a wide path for the 2 men. They could smell the power radiating from Alan, and they instinctively moved out of his way. The string quartet sitting in the corner remained completely frozen, their bows resting silently on their instruments. The entire room felt like a suspended breath waiting for the final blow to land. Alan walked with a slow, deliberate stride, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He ignored the towering floral arrangements and the extravagant chocolate fountain. He walked directly toward the center of the room where I was standing over my weeping daughter-in-law. The wealthy guests watched in absolute stunned silence. They could not understand why a high-powered corporate lawyer was walking straight toward the old man in faded denim jeans and heavy work boots. When Alan reached me, he did not look at Madison or Brian. He stopped perfectly straight, gave me a deep, respectful nod, and stood silently by my side, awaiting my instruction. The visual contrast between my sawdust-covered clothes and his immaculate suit was jarring, but the undeniable respect he showed me sent a profound shockwave through the room. The guests who had been mocking my aesthetic just moments before suddenly looked incredibly uneasy. I turned my head slightly and nodded at the broad-shouldered man in the gray suit. The man stepped forward, bypassing Brian entirely, and stood directly over Madison. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents, bound by a thick red rubber band. He looked down at the ruined woman kneeling in the broken glass. He asked in a loud, clear voice if she was Madison. Madison was too terrified to speak. She just nodded her head, her tears smearing her dark makeup across her pale cheeks. The man dropped the heavy stack of papers onto the floor right in front of her bleeding knees. He stated loudly that she was officially served. He then took a large step back, his job entirely complete. Madison stared at the thick stack of papers as if it were a venomous snake. She did not reach out to touch it. Alan Croft then stepped forward, taking complete control of the room. His voice was smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of any sympathy. He introduced himself to Brian and Madison, stating his full name and his position as the senior legal counsel for the holding company that now owned their debt. He told Madison that the papers sitting in front of her were the official execution of a hostile foreclosure. He explained that because the loan was secured through fraudulent means and the default deadline had passed, the holding company was exercising its absolute right to immediate asset seizure. Alan did not use complicated legal jargon. He wanted every single person in the room to understand the absolute devastation of the situation. He told Madison she had exactly 48 hours to vacate the leased townhouse. He explained that the holding company had already contacted the local sheriff's department, and if she and Brian were not completely moved out by Tuesday morning, armed deputies would arrive to physically remove them from the premises. He also noted that the locks would be changed, the security codes would be wiped, and any personal property left inside would be seized to offset the remaining balance of the defaulted loan. Brian let out a low, agonizing groan, covering his face with his trembling hands. The reality of being rendered entirely homeless in less than 2 days was crashing down on him. Madison tried to argue, her voice weak and pathetic. She looked up at Alan and begged for an extension, claiming she had a newborn baby and nowhere to go. She pointed a shaking finger at me and told Alan that her father-in-law had a cashier's check for $30,000 and we could settle the debt right now in this very room. Alan looked down at her with an expression of pure professional disgust. He told her the holding company did not want her money. He told her the debt portfolio had been purchased specifically to execute the foreclosure. He explained that the holding company had zero interest in negotiating with a woman who had committed multiple federal felonies to secure the initial loan. He let the words federal felonies hang heavily in the air, reminding the wealthy guests watching the spectacle that Madison was not just broke, she was a criminal. He told her the foreclosure was only the first step in the process. He informed her that his legal team had already compiled the evidence of her wire fraud and identity theft, and they would be submitting the entire dossier to the federal prosecutor's office on Monday morning. He made it perfectly clear that the holding company was going to pursue maximum criminal charges, and she would likely be facing years in a federal penitentiary. The sheer finality of Alan's words destroyed the last remaining fragment of Madison's sanity. She realized there was no escape. There was no secret bank transfer that could save her, and there was no wealthy friend in this room who would ever associate with her again. She was going to lose her house, her luxury lifestyle, and her absolute freedom. She collapsed forward, resting her forehead against the cold marble floor, sobbing with a level of absolute despair that echoed through the massive, opulent conservatory. I stood silently watching the absolute destruction of the arrogant kingdom she had built completely from lies. Madison looked up at Alan Croft, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She was frantically trying to process how a corporate lawyer from a massive holding company had tracked her down to a private country club brunch. She looked from Alan to the process server, and then finally her gaze shifted back to me. For the first time since she met me, the absolute certainty in her eyes began to waver. She saw how Alan stood slightly behind me, his posture entirely deferential. She saw how I was not reacting with panic or confusion like a normal grandfather should. The pieces were slowly, painfully clicking together in her mind, but her arrogance simply would not allow her to accept the picture they formed. "Vincent," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "Vincent, please do something. You have the cashier's check. Tell this lawyer you are paying the balance. Tell him we are settling the debt." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the thick white envelope one last time. I looked at it, and then I opened my hand and let the envelope fall to the floor. It landed right next to the shattered crystal glass. "I did not bring a check, Madison," I said, my voice perfectly calm and even. "I told you on the phone that I would bring exactly what you deserve. I told you I would solve your financial problems, and I have. By foreclosing on your townhouse, the holding company will absorb your remaining debt. You will be completely bankrupt, but you will no longer owe the loan sharks a single penny." Brian took a shaky step forward, his face completely ashen. "Dad," he asked, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "How do you know this lawyer? Why is he standing behind you?" I turned my eyes to my son. I felt a brief hollow ache in my chest, but I pushed it down. I told Brian the truth I had kept hidden for over 6 years. I told him that when his mother passed away, I sold my freight company for $38 million. The collective gasp from the wealthy guests behind him was incredibly loud, but I ignored them entirely. I told Brian I hid the money in blind trusts because I wanted him to build his own life. I wanted him to earn his pride. But I told him I was soft. I told him I could not bear to see him struggle, so I set up a holding company to subsidize his life. I watched Brian's eyes widen in absolute horror as I dismantled his entire reality piece by piece. I told him the quarterly bonuses he was so proud of did not come from his employer. They came from me. I told him the mortgage on the townhouse was artificially low because my trust was paying 60% of it every single month. Then I looked down at Madison, who was completely paralyzed on the marble floor. I told her the anonymous angel investor, who had been keeping her useless boutique startup afloat for 2 years, was also me. I told them I funded every single piece of luxury they owned. The cars, the clothes, the country club dues, it all came from the calloused hands of the old man they were so ashamed of. Madison let out a small, pathetic, whimpering sound, covering her mouth with her bleeding hands. The realization that she had bitten the exact hand that fed her was destroying her from the inside out. I looked around the opulent conservatory, taking in the imported flowers and the terrified, wealthy guests. I looked back at Madison. "You told me I could not come to the baby shower because I did not fit your aesthetic?" I said, my voice echoing clearly across the room. "You said my flannel shirt and my work boots would ruin your perfect pictures. You thought I was just a poor, pathetic relic who did not belong in your high society circle." I took a step closer to her, looking down with absolute cold authority. "You were absolutely right, Madison," I continued. "I do not fit in. I do not fit in with people who finance their lives with loan sharks. I do not fit in with people who commit federal wire fraud to buy designer handbags. I do not fit in with frauds who care more about the opinions of strangers than the loyalty of their own family. Real wealth does not need to scream for attention. Real wealth is silent. It builds things that last. You build things out of paper and lies, and now the wind has finally blown them down." She stared up at me, completely broken, entirely stripped of her fake superiority. She reached out one trembling hand toward my heavy work boot, but she stopped before she touched it. She finally understood the absolute magnitude of her mistake. "When you called me sobbing, playing the victim, and begging for $30,000, I asked you a question," I said, letting the finality of the moment settle over the room. "I asked you if you remembered how you treated me. You thought you could just use my grandson as collateral to manipulate my heart. But you forgot that a man who builds an empire from scratch knows exactly how to spot a bad investment." I looked at Brian one last time. He was weeping silently, his shoulders shaking, as he mourned the death of the life he thought he had earned. I told him I loved him, but I could no longer protect him from the consequences of his own weakness. I told him he had to learn how to stand on his own 2 feet, because the safety net was permanently gone. I turned back to Madison, who was staring at the foreclosure papers on the marble floor. "Didn't I warn you?" I asked softly. I turned my back on her, leaving her weeping in the ruins of her fake kingdom. I nodded to Alan Croft, and we walked out of the conservatory together, leaving the opulent brunch in absolute devastating silence. The heavy oak doors of the conservatory swung shut behind Alan and me, leaving a suffocating silence in our wake. Even though I was walking down the carpeted hallway toward the exit, I knew exactly what was happening inside that room. The absolute destruction of Madison's carefully curated world did not happen with a loud explosion. It happened with the quiet, frantic shuffling of expensive leather shoes heading straight for the door. The wealthy women from the yoga studio and the prominent real estate investors did not offer Madison a single word of comfort. In their high society circles, financial ruin was considered an infectious disease and criminal fraud was an absolute death sentence. They began gathering their designer purses and adjusting their silk wraps, moving as quickly as politely possible toward the exit. Madison pushed herself up from the marble floor, ignoring the blood dripping from her scraped knees. She reached out her trembling hand toward the wife of the prominent developer, begging her not to leave. She promised it was all a huge misunderstanding and pleaded that they could still cut the cake and open the expensive gifts. The woman looked at Madison as if she were a rotting corpse. She did not say a single word. She simply pulled her expensive silk dress out of Madison's reach, turned her back, and walked out of the room. The other guests followed immediately, leaving their half-empty crystal champagne flutes on the tables. Within 3 minutes, the massive, opulent conservatory was completely empty of guests. The only people left were the hired string quartet, who were rapidly packing their instruments into their velvet cases, and the catering staff who were staring awkwardly at the floor, wishing they were anywhere else. Brian had not moved a single muscle since I walked out. He was standing near the towering chocolate fountain, looking down at the legal documents scattered across the marble floor. The heavy red ink of the foreclosure notice seemed to burn directly into his eyes. He slowly crouched down, picking up the third page of the packet. He stared at his own name printed perfectly on the digital signature line. He ran his thumb over the black ink, finally understanding the absolute depth of his wife's betrayal. She had not just maxed out credit cards to buy luxury clothing. She had actively logged into his computer, stolen his identity, and forged his legal consent to hand over their home to a group of predatory loan sharks. The woman he had married, the woman he had alienated his own father to protect, had turned him into an unknowing accomplice to federal wire fraud. He thought about the years he spent looking down on my faded flannel shirts and my calloused hands, believing he had achieved a superior life. Now he realized that my calloused hands had built the only real things in his world, while his wife had constructed a terrifying trap made entirely of lies and stolen money. Madison turned around and saw Brian holding the forged document. She let out a desperate, pathetic sob and took a step toward him. Her flawless hair was a tangled mess, and her expensive white maternity dress was stained with tears and blood from the broken glass. She tried to fall back on the exact same manipulative tactics she had used to control him for years. She told him she did it all for them. She cried about the immense pressure she felt to provide a perfect aesthetic for their newborn baby. She begged Brian to call his corporate lawyers to see if they could fight the holding company in court. She reached out her hands and told him they had to stick together because they were a team. Brian looked up from the paper. The hollow, exhausted look in his eyes had been completely replaced by a cold, hardened clarity. He finally saw the absolute monster hiding beneath her expensive clothes. He shook his head slowly, his voice completely devoid of any affection or warmth. He told her there was no team. He told her a team does not commit identity theft behind closed doors. He told her a team does not use an unborn child as leverage to extort $30,000 from an elderly man. He looked around the lavish room, taking in the towering floral arrangements, the silver trays of miniature pastries, and the pristine white leather designer handbag sitting on the gift table. He realized that every single thing in his life was entirely fake. He dropped the forged document back onto the marble floor, letting it flutter down onto the shattered crystal. He looked at Madison and told her he was going back to the townhouse to pack a single suitcase before the armed deputies arrived to change the locks. He told her she was entirely on her own. Madison screamed his name, her voice echoing shrilly across the empty room. She lunged forward, trying to grab the sleeve of his tailored linen suit, but he stepped away with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. He told her not to touch him. He told her to contact a criminal defense attorney because he was not going to lie to the federal prosecutors to save her from a prison sentence. He turned his back on his weeping wife and walked toward the double doors. He did not look back at the mountain of expensive baby gifts or the luxurious spread of catered food. He walked out of the Oak Ridge Country Club, leaving Madison completely alone, kneeling in the ruins of her own blinding arrogance. The drought had finally consumed her entirely, and there was no one left in the world to offer her a single drop of water. 6 months passed since the heavy oak doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club closed behind me. The long, bitter winter eventually gave way to a quiet spring. The massive glass and steel townhouse where my son once lived was completely empty now. It was sold at a private auction by my holding company just 3 weeks after the brunch. I did not keep the money from the sale. I placed every single dollar into a locked, ironclad trust entirely reserved for my grandson. Brian did not fight the eviction. He packed a single suitcase and walked away from the artificial life he could not afford. Today, he lives in a small one-bedroom apartment above a noisy dry cleaner on the edge of town. The expensive tailored linen suits are completely gone. He wears heavy denim work pants and steel-toed boots. When he realized his corporate job would not cover his basic living expenses, without my secret subsidies, he quit. He took a job on a commercial construction site. For the first time in his entire life, my son comes home with dirt under his fingernails and an aching back. He is finally learning the honest, brutal value of a single dollar. He is currently fighting a grueling legal battle for full custody of his son. He does not ask me for legal fees. He pays his cheap family lawyer with the money he earns from mixing concrete and carrying heavy steel beams. When he looks at his own calloused hands, he finally understands the sacrifices I made for him all those years ago. I watch him from a distance, seeing the crippling arrogance bleed out of him, replaced by a slow, quiet dignity. He is finally becoming a man. Madison, on the other hand, is drowning in a nightmare entirely of her own making. The federal prosecutors did not offer her a lenient plea deal. When Alan Croft handed over the extensive dossier proving wire fraud and identity theft, the authorities moved swiftly. Her boutique startup was completely liquidated by the state to pay off a fraction of her massive credit card debt. She was forced to declare total bankruptcy. With absolutely no money and no wealthy friends willing to answer her desperate phone calls, she had to move into the cramped, damp basement of her parents' house. The parents who once proudly stood by the chocolate fountain at her lavish baby shower now look at her with deep, suffocating shame. They barely speak to her. She spends her days sitting in that dark basement, staring at mountains of terrifying legal paperwork. Her criminal trial begins next month, and the public defender assigned to her case has already warned her to prepare for a lengthy federal prison sentence. The designer maternity clothes and the expensive silk dresses were all seized and auctioned off by the bankruptcy courts. The exclusive rare Birkin handbag she bought with stolen loan shark money was confiscated as federal criminal evidence. She has absolutely nothing left. The wealthy aesthetic she valued more than basic human decency was completely stripped away, leaving only a terrified, broken woman waiting for the heavy gavel of justice to fall. I do not feel joy when I think about her sitting in that dark basement. Vengeance was never the ultimate goal of my silent adjustment. The goal was to completely remove a toxic parasite from my family bloodline before she could infect my innocent grandson with her blinding greed. The financial surgery was brutal, and the emotional recovery for my son has been incredibly painful. But the suffocating rot has been successfully cut out. The dangerous illusion has been destroyed, and the concrete foundation of a real, honest life has finally been poured. It is a quiet Tuesday morning in my garage. The heavy scent of cedar and fresh sawdust fills the air, bringing me a profound sense of peace. I am standing at my wooden workbench, running a soft cloth, over the smooth, polished rails of the cherry wood crib. The canvas tarp has been permanently removed. I finished applying the final coat of protective oil yesterday, and the wood glows with a deep, rich warmth. The violent chaos of the past 6 months feels like a distant storm that has finally passed over the horizon, leaving the air clean and breathable. I am no longer playing the role of a pathetic, helpless old man, and I am no longer carrying the crushing weight of a secret financial empire. I am simply a grandfather building something solid for the next generation. My grandson was born healthy and strong just 2 weeks ago. When Brian brought him over to my house for the first time, I held the tiny boy in my calloused hands and felt an overwhelming wave of unconditional love. But this time that love is protected by absolute boundaries. I sat down with Alan Croft and created an impenetrable legal fortress around the money I secured from the townhouse sale. The trust I established for my grandson is locked tight. It will fund his education, his medical needs, and his future. But there is a strict, legally binding clause that prevents his mother from ever accessing a single penny of it. Madison can never use this innocent boy as leverage against me or anyone else ever again. I have guaranteed his safety without sacrificing my own dignity. I hear the familiar rumble of a heavy engine pulling into my driveway. It is not my old Ford, but the beat-up work vehicle Brian drives now. He is coming over on his lunch break from the construction site to help me carry the heavy crib into the back of his truck so we can set it up in his small apartment. He walks into the garage wearing his steel-toed boots, a tired but genuine smile on his face. He looks at the crib and runs his hand along the smooth wood, appreciating the honest labor it took to build it. We do not talk about the country club or the loan sharks. We talk about the weather, the baby, and the hard work of building a good life. I did not destroy my family to get revenge. I tore down a poisonous facade so a real family could finally grow in its place. I am 69 years old, and as I stand here watching my son lift his end of the heavy wooden crib, I know that true wealth is not about fitting into an aesthetic. It is about having the strength to protect the truth. The most profound lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional financial support. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, honest labor, and genuine loyalty, not on the fragile illusion of wealth or social status. By constantly shielding my son from the consequences of his actions, I almost allowed him to be destroyed by a woman who valued a designer aesthetic over basic human decency. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is to let their child fall so they can finally learn how to stand up on their own. If you have ever had to make a painful decision to cut ties with toxic entitlement to protect your peace, let me know your story in the comments below and hit subscribe to join our community.